What happens when a century-old family legacy is threatened by an HOA's overreach? What lengths would you go to protect your heritage and stand up for justice? David Johnson thought his peaceful life would last, until Rebecca Wilson tried to erase his grandfather's history. Can David fight back and save what's rightfully his? Watch this thrilling story unfold. Don't forget to like and subscribe. David Johnson stood at the edge of the old stone well on his grandfather's farm, his fingers tracing the rough surface of the stones that had stood for over a century. The well was more than just a source of water. It was a symbol of his family's legacy. David had inherited the farm after his grandfather's passing, and the responsibility to maintain it, especially the well, was now his. David had never expected to inherit a farm. Growing up in the city, he'd always thought of the farm as a place of occasional visits, not something he would one day call his own. But when his grandfather, Joe Johnson, passed away, the lawyer's words were clear. Your grandfather left everything to you, David. The farm, the land, the well. It's all yours now. The words hit him harder than he expected. The well had been a part of David's childhood, a link to a past he hadn't fully appreciated until now. His grandfather had shown him how to draw water from it when David was just 8 years old, a memory he held dear. Now, with Grandpa gone, David was determined to preserve the farm and everything it represented. The farm was beautiful, but in need of work. The house was old and the land was overgrown, but the rolling hills, the tall oak trees, and the quiet serenity of the countryside offered David a fresh start. After years of city living, this place felt like a sanctuary. He spent his first few weekends clearing the land, fixing fences, and repairing the roof over the well. It was hard work, but David loved it. The farm was now his, and it felt like a second chance. One morning, as David worked in his vegetable garden, a couple of neighbors came by, Sarah and David Thompson. They were in their 50s and 60s, respectively, and welcomed him warmly with a basket of muffins. "We're so glad someone's living here again," Sarah said, smiling. "Your grandfather was such a wonderful man." David smiled back, grateful for the warm welcome. "It's good to meet you both," he said. "This place means a lot to me." As they chatted, Sarah mentioned that the Homeowners Association, HOA, had been getting stricter about enforcing rules. "There's a new board member who's a bit overzealous about following the rules," Sarah said cautiously, glancing at her husband. David chuckled. "Don't worry. Grandpa made sure the farm is exempt from HOA regulations. I have the paperwork." Sarah and David Thompson seemed relieved but also wary. "Good to know," David Thompson said quietly, "but just be careful. The new board member isn't someone you want to mess with." That night, as David mulled over the conversation, he began to feel a sense of unease. It wasn't just about the HOA. There was something in the air, something that made David feel like an outsider in a place he thought would be his sanctuary. A few days later, while working outside, David noticed a woman approaching his fence. She was wearing an expensive-looking tracksuit, and her blonde hair was tightly pulled into a ponytail. Despite the cloudy sky, she wore oversized sunglasses and carried herself with an air of authority. "You must be Joe's grandchild," the woman said, not bothering with introductions. "Yes, I'm David Johnson," he replied, wiping his hands on his jeans. "I'm Rebecca Wilson," she said, her voice crisp. "Vice President of the HOA, we've been getting complaints about your property." David felt a knot form in his stomach. "Complaints? About what?" "Your well," Rebecca said, pointing toward it with a manicured finger. "It's an eyesore. The HOA requires all water features to be approved." David took a deep breath. "This property was established before the HOA. My grandfather negotiated an exemption. It's not subject to those rules." Rebecca's smile tightened. "No property is exempt from maintaining community standards," she said, her phone already in hand as she began to take pictures of the well. David held his ground. "I have the documents to prove it." Rebecca didn't respond. Instead, she turned and walked away, her high heels clicking against the gravel, but David could feel the weight of the situation growing. The HOA wasn't just about property rules. It was personal. David's first encounter with Rebecca Wilson had left him uneasy, but it was only the beginning. The next few days were filled with what seemed like harmless interactions at first, but the tension was growing. Each time David stepped outside, he couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were watching him, not just out of curiosity, but out of something darker. It wasn't until Rebecca returned that things truly escalated. She showed up one morning, unannounced, with a stack of papers in her hand. This time, her tone was sharper, more confrontational. "David," she said, her eyes scanning the yard, "I've been reviewing the HOA rules and regulations again, and I've found more violations on your property. This well is a clear breach of the standards we're trying to uphold in Willow Creek Estates." She pointed toward the stone well, her finger tracing the familiar structure that had been there long before the neighborhood even existed. David's patience was thinning. "I've explained this to you before, Rebecca. This well is exempt from the HOA's rules. My grandfather made sure of that when the neighborhood was first developed." Rebecca didn't seem convinced. "Well, that may have been true, but things have changed. The HOA has grown stricter. There are no exceptions." She handed him a letter detailing violations that seemed to have no foundation at all: unapproved landscaping, non-compliant structures, and now, the well. It all felt like a formality to her, a way to poke holes in his rights. David flipped through the letter, his fingers trembling slightly as he read the baseless accusations. "These are all lies. I have the original documents from when the property was developed. The well was grandfathered in. You're wasting your time." But Rebecca remained unfazed. "I'm just doing my job," she said coldly, her eyes narrowing. "You should have followed the rules. Now the fines will start accumulating. If you refuse to comply, we'll have no choice but to take this further." David could feel the heat rising in his chest, the frustration starting to boil over. "This is absurd. I'm not going to comply with something that's not even valid." But Rebecca wasn't done. She delivered her final threat. "We'll see about that. The board is meeting soon and they'll decide how to handle this. You'll regret not following the rules." As she turned and walked away, David felt a cold wave of realization wash over him. This wasn't just about a well. The HOA wasn't merely concerned with rules. It was personal. His skin, his presence in the neighborhood, the fact that he was black. He couldn't ignore the pattern anymore. David had always been aware of the subtle racism that existed in the world around him, but this felt different. He realized that the HOA's real motivation wasn't about property standards. It was about making him feel unwelcome. They wanted him to leave. The well, the fines, the rules, it was all a cover for something much deeper, a desire to push him out simply because of his race. He stared out over the land, the beautiful farm his grandfather had built. The peaceful life he had hoped for was slipping away, replaced by something uglier. And now David knew what he had to do: fight back, not just for the well, but for his right to be there, to exist, and to honor his family's legacy. Rebecca Wilson didn't hesitate to escalate the conflict. Despite David's firm stance, she relentlessly pushed forward with her agenda, making it clear that she was determined to enforce her version of what Willow Creek Estates should look like, no matter the cost. David had hoped his resistance would stop her, but Rebecca, as vice president of the HOA, wasn't backing down. The situation reached a breaking point when David had to leave town for a business trip. Though the trip had been planned for months, it was during his absence that Rebecca saw her opportunity to act. When David returned, he immediately felt something was wrong. As he pulled into the driveway, he saw a truck parked in front of his property, loaded with bags of concrete. Several workers were walking back and forth, hauling bags toward the well. David's heart sank. He rushed out of the car, a sense of dread building in his chest. "What's going on here?" he demanded as he approached the workers. One of the men stopped and looked up at him with a puzzled expression. "You're the owner?" the worker asked, trying to read David's reaction. "Yes," David replied, his voice tight with anger. "Who told you to do this?" "We've been instructed by Rebecca Wilson from the HOA," the worker explained, clearly uncomfortable. "She said it was an emergency measure for safety." David felt the fury bubbling up inside him. Emergency? This well has been here for over a century. It's part of my family's legacy. He took a step forward, feeling his control slipping. "I'm just following orders," the worker said, shrugging and turning back to the truck. David stood there, frozen in disbelief as the workers continued their task. He watched, helpless, as the well was filled in with concrete. His grandfather's pride, the well that had served the farm for generations, was being destroyed before his eyes. This wasn't just a well. It was a piece of his family's history, and now it was gone. David pulled out his phone and dialed the police, but deep down, he knew this wasn't something they could solve. The issue wasn't about property damage, it was about the HOA's overreach and their desire to erase his family's history. The real fight would be in the courtroom. By the time the workers finished their task, the well had been replaced by a solid mass of concrete. David felt sick to his stomach, but he also knew he had no choice but to fight back. This wasn't just about the well. It was about his right to live here, his right to honor his grandfather's legacy, and his right to stand up against the HOA's racially motivated actions. That evening, David called Elaine Morales, a lawyer who had helped him in the past. He explained everything that had happened, and Elaine listened carefully. "You've got a strong case, David," she said after a long pause. "The well is protected by historical preservation laws. The HOA had no right to destroy it. We'll go after them for this." David felt a sense of relief, but he knew that winning this battle wouldn't be easy. Elaine advised him to gather all the necessary documentation, including the original exemption agreement his grandfather had signed when the neighborhood was first developed. The following morning, David contacted the local Historical Preservation Society. He explained the situation, and they assured him that hand-dug wells from the settlement period were becoming rare, and if he could prove its historical significance, it could be officially protected. That same day, he arranged for security cameras to be installed around the property, both visible and hidden, so he could document every move the HOA made. David spent the next several days assembling evidence. He took photos of the well before and after its destruction, reviewed old family documents, and contacted the neighbors who had supported him to get their testimonies. He knew this wasn't just about the well. It was about his right to be there, to honor his family's history, and to fight back against the discrimination he was facing. As the days passed, David's resolve only strengthened. He would fight for his family's legacy, for justice, and for his right to remain in the community. The HOA might have thought they could bully him into submission, but David was ready to take them on, no matter how difficult the road ahead would be. He would make sure that his grandfather's well and his family's history would not be erased. David had spent days preparing his legal case, carefully gathering evidence to fight back against the HOA's attempts to destroy his family's legacy. But it wasn't until Elaine Morales, his lawyer, mentioned something unexpected that the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. "David," Elaine began cautiously, "I found something unusual while going through the property records. Your grandfather helped Rebecca's family in the 1970s. He provided a private loan to Thomas Wilson, Rebecca's father, to help them avoid bankruptcy." David froze. He had never heard of this before. "Why didn't I know about this?" he asked, trying to piece together the implications. Elaine continued, "It seems that the loan wasn't just financial help. Your grandfather made certain conditions with Thomas Wilson regarding the land, conditions that involved preserving certain features like the well to protect your family's legacy. But from what I found, Rebecca's family didn't honor those terms. They've been attempting to erase your grandfather's influence in this neighborhood." David felt his mind race. How could he not have known about this? His grandfather had always kept things close to the chest, but this was something that could explain so much about the animosity between their families. David spent the next several days digging through his grandfather's old documents, searching for anything that might shed light on this connection. It wasn't long before he found a letter buried in the back of a drawer in his grandfather's study. The letter, dated from the early 1980s, was addressed to Thomas Wilson. It was a formal document, but the tone was unmistakably firm. It outlined specific terms for maintaining the property, including the preservation of landmarks like the well. David's grandfather had clearly outlined what would happen if the Wilsons failed to meet those conditions. The letter also made it clear that if the loan wasn't repaid, Thomas Wilson's family was to uphold these terms in perpetuity. It was a generous loan, one that David's grandfather had never demanded to be paid back. Yet it came with the expectation of preserving the land's history. But as David read through the letter, a deeper realization settled in. Rebecca's family had violated those terms. The well, which was meant to be protected, had become a target, as had other parts of the land. Rebecca's family had erased the historical connections to David's family, manipulating records and avoiding the terms his grandfather had set. But it didn't stop there. David's hands shook as he continued to sift through the papers. The more he read, the more he discovered. Hidden among the documents was evidence of shady land deals and fraudulent actions that Rebecca's family had taken to bypass his grandfather's protections. They had secretly worked with developers to alter parts of the land that were supposed to remain untouched. They had not only violated the agreement, but had also done everything they could to erase any trace of David's family's influence in the neighborhood. David's blood ran cold. He couldn't believe what he was reading. His grandfather had helped Rebecca's family when they were in financial trouble, and in return, they had betrayed him. They had stolen his family's legacy, and now, Rebecca was trying to erase the last piece of it, the well that had stood for over a century. Feeling both anger and determination, David knew what he had to do. This wasn't just about a well anymore. This was a fight to preserve his family's history and protect what his grandfather had worked so hard to build. With these documents in hand, David had the ammunition he needed to fight back, not just against Rebecca, but against her entire family's attempt to rewrite history. David wasn't going to let Rebecca destroy his family's legacy. He would take them to court, expose their deceit, and make sure they could never again erase the truth. The battle had just begun, and David was ready to make sure the Wilsons wouldn't get away with their lies. The day of the trial arrived, and David stood in the courtroom, feeling a quiet confidence despite the nerves in his stomach. Across from him sat Rebecca Wilson, her lawyer beside her, the smugness fading as David prepared to present the evidence. This was the moment to hold her accountable for everything she had done. Elaine Morales, David's lawyer, began by presenting the historical preservation agreement his grandfather had set up to protect the well and other landmarks. She introduced the key documents David had uncovered, letters, contracts, and records showing how Rebecca's family had violated these terms by working with developers to destroy the historical elements of the property. David took the stand, explaining his grandfather's loan to the Wilson family in the 1970s, the terms attached to it, and how Rebecca's family had broken those terms. As he laid out the facts, It became clear that Rebecca's claims of following HOA rules were just a cover for their own manipulative actions. Elaine presented the video footage showing Rebecca directing workers to pour concrete into the well, and Rebecca's defense crumbled. There was no denying her involvement. When the judge returned after deliberation, she made the verdict clear. Rebecca Wilson was guilty of destroying a historic property. David felt a weight lift off his shoulders. He had won. The well would be restored. In the weeks that followed, the community rallied around David. Rebecca was removed from the HOA, and the organization was dissolved, replaced by a new heritage committee focused on preserving the history of Willow Creek Estates. The well was restored, a plaque now marking its historical significance. David's victory was a triumph not only for him but for the entire community. The fight had been long, but his grandfather's legacy was safe, and David knew that the past could never be erased again. The well stood proudly, a reminder of the importance of history, justice, and standing up for what was right. David's victory was not just about the well, it was about justice, perseverance, and the power of standing up for what's right. Despite facing racial discrimination and immense challenges, he had fought back with unwavering determination. By preserving his family's legacy, he sent a powerful message to the community: justice and equality should always prevail, no matter the obstacles. David's fight was a reminder that no one should be silenced or pushed aside, and that standing up against the abuse of power can lead to meaningful change. His victory inspired others to defend what was rightfully theirs.